A simple, ordinary girl accidentally enters the vampire king's world, where everyone sees her as unworthy, but the king treats her with honor and protects her like a queen in every gathering. When palace conspiracies and old enemies put her life in danger, the king breaks the laws of his own kingdom to choose her. In the end, everyone realizes that a true queen is not chosen by blood or lineage, but by heart and loyalty. Rain had been falling since dusk, soft at first, then heavy enough to make the street lamps look like they were drowning in gold. I remember thinking the night sounded lonely, until I heard footsteps that didn't belong to any living person. I wasn't looking for a castle, I was looking for a shortcut home. The old city ended in a slope of black stone and forgotten gardens, the kind of place people avoided out of habit, not logic. My shoes slipped on wet cobbles as I cut through the iron gate that always seemed locked but tonight stood open, quietly like it had been waiting. The air changed the moment I crossed the threshold, colder, cleaner, scented with rain-soaked roses and something older beneath it, like paper in a sealed library. Ahead, the mansion rose with its windows lit in amber. Not warm, not welcoming, just awake. I should have turned back, I did not, because somewhere behind me on the street I'd left, voices had been calling my name with an edge that turned my stomach. I had no proof they were following me, only that terrible instinct that says, run. So I ran forward instead, up the long path where the hedges stood tall and severe, and the statues watched with ruined faces and patient mouths. When the doors opened, they did it without a hand touching them. The entry hall was enormous, candlelit, and too quiet for a place that felt so alive. My breath fogged in the air. I hugged my jacket tighter and tried to tell myself that fear was just a story my mind was inventing, like the ones my grandmother used to warn me about, kings who lived forever and paid for it with everyone else's peace. A figure stood at the far end of the hall, half shadowed by a staircase that curved like a question mark. He did not move quickly. He didn't need to. The stillness around him seemed to rearrange itself to make space. He was taller than I expected, dressed in dark clothes that looked like they'd never known dust. His hair was pale, almost silver under the candlelight, and his skin carried that moonlit calm that made my heartbeat stutter. But it was his eyes that made me stop breathing, not red the way stories insisted, but a deep, bruised color like twilight held too long. He looked at me like he could hear my thoughts, like he could hear the parts of me I didn't say out loud. "Your shoes are soaked," he said softly, as if that was the most important truth in the room. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a joke, it was concern, the kind no one had offered me in weeks. The words hit something tender in my chest, and I hated how quickly my eyes burned. "I didn't mean to," my voice cracked, betraying me. "I just needed." "Safety," he finished, not guessing, knowing. A candle flickered, and the shadows along the walls seemed to lean in. I felt the sharp edge of fear again, the kind that is less about monsters and more about power, about being small in a world built to decide your worth without asking. "Oh, you shouldn't be here," I whispered. He took a step forward, slow enough that I could choose to run. He didn't chase my fear. He waited for my courage. "And yet," he said, "here you are." Something in his expression shifted then, so quick I almost missed it. Pain, old and familiar, like he'd watched 1,000 frightened people and had never stopped caring. That possibility was the most dangerous thing of all because it made him feel real. A sound came from outside. A distant clang, metal on metal, and then a low murmur that traveled through the rain like a promise. "The voices." My body went cold. They followed me. He didn't ask who, he didn't question whether I deserved help. He only turned his head slightly, listening, and the entire mansion seemed to listen with him. When he faced me again, the gentleness remained, but something else rose beneath it, an authority so quiet it felt like gravity. "Come closer to the fire," he said, gesturing to a sitting room where flames moved behind a grate. "You're trembling." I didn't move, I couldn't, because I'd just noticed what I'd been too terrified to see at first. The crest on the wall behind him, carved into stone and crowned with a symbol the city pretended was only myth. And beneath it, written in an old script I shouldn't have been able to read, were words that made my knees weaken. Vampire King. My throat tightened. What are you? For the first time, he looked like someone weighing a truth that could break both of us. I am the reason the gates are locked most nights, he said, and the reason they were open tonight. The rain struck the windows harder. Outside, the murmuring voices became clearer, closer, impatient. Someone tried the iron gate. It groaned. I took one shaky step back and my heel caught on the edge of the rug. I stumbled. Instantly, he crossed the distance. Not with a blur, not with something unnatural, but with the controlled speed of someone who refuses to frighten you. His hand reached out and steadied me by the elbow, careful as if I were made of glass. His touch wasn't cold. It was warm. He released me immediately, like he feared what his kindness might awaken. He looked past me toward the doors, and for a second the mask slipped. I saw exhaustion. I saw loneliness deep enough to fill centuries. And I saw something I didn't understand at all: relief. As if my presence had answered a question he'd been asking in the dark for a very long time. Then, from outside, a voice rose above the others, sharp and familiar. "Open up," it called. "We know she's in there." My stomach dropped. I recognized that voice. It belonged to someone who had once promised to protect me. The Vampire King didn't flinch. He simply stepped between me and the door like a shield, and in that moment I realized the real danger wasn't that he might hurt me. It was that he might choose to protect me, even if it cost him everything. He turned slightly, not taking his eyes off the doors, and spoke to me in a low, steady voice. "If you stay," he said, "they will call you mine." The iron gate outside screamed as it strained. "And if I do," I whispered. His jaw tightened, and there was something heartbreakingly human in the way he answered. "Then you will go back to people who already decided you were disposable." The voices surged closer. The mansion's candles flickered as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The Vampire King lifted his hand toward the door, calm, commanding, merciful, and I understood that whatever he was about to do would change my life. Because he wasn't asking if I feared him. He was asking without saying it, "Do you trust me enough to be saved by me?" And before I could answer, the front door began to open from the outside. The door crept inward with the slow confidence of someone who believed the world still belonged to them. Rain blew into the hall in a cold sheet, carrying the smell of wet stone and angry breath, and the candle flames leaned away as if even fire wanted distance. The Vampire King didn't step back. He didn't bare teeth or raise his voice. He simply stood there between me and the gap widening in the door like a promise made out of silence. A man's silhouette filled the opening. He wore a dark coat and a familiar posture, shoulders squared the way I used to admire. For a heartbeat, my mind reached for the safer memory of him, the one who'd walked me home once, who'd told me I was family, who'd said no one would ever touch me while he was around. Then he spoke, and that memory cracked. "There you are," he said, smiling as if he'd found something misplaced. "You had us worried." Behind him, two more figures shifted under the porch light. Their faces stayed half hidden, but their attention was sharp, fixed on me like I was an object and not a person. My throat tightened. "You followed me." The man's smile didn't change. "We came to bring you back. You don't belong in a place like this." The Vampire King tilted his head slightly, studying him the way a judge studies a lie. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle enough to be mistaken for kindness, until you heard the steel underneath. "She came here seeking safety," he said. "That is the only reason anyone crosses my threshold." The man's gaze slid to him, and I watched the confidence flicker just a fraction. People in the city told stories about the Lord of the Old Mansion, always in a tone that tried to sound amused. A myth, a joke, a shadow nobody truly believed in. But standing there, framed by candlelight and storm, the Vampire King didn't feel like a story. Oh, he felt like the truth. The man cleared his throat as if politeness could protect him. "With respect, she's under my care." Under my care, the words landed like a chain. I couldn't stop myself. No, I'm not. The man's eyes snapped back to me, and for the first time the mask slipped. Not rage, something colder. Calculation. The look you give a door that won't open the way it's supposed to. You're scared, he said, voice suddenly soft. You're confused. Come on, we'll take you home. Home, another word that used to mean safety and now felt like a trap. The vampire king glanced at me, not long, not dramatic, just enough to give me something rare, choice. His eyes asked a question without pressure. "Well, do you want me to end this?" I swallowed. My hands were shaking, but a strange steadiness grew inside my chest, warming around the fear. I took a breath and stepped forward until I was just behind the vampire king's shoulder. The closeness should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like standing behind a wall that wouldn't move. "I'm not going with you," I said. The silence fell heavy and clean. The man exhaled as if I'd embarrassed him in public. "Don't do this," he murmured. Then his gaze drifted to the vampire king's face and his voice sharpened. This isn't your business." The vampire king's expression didn't change, but the air did. The candles steadied, flames drawing taller as if the room itself straightened its spine. "She is not an item to be collected," he said calmly, "and you do not speak of care while you stand with men who hide their faces." One of the figures behind the man shifted, impatient. "We're wasting time," he muttered. The man lifted a hand, a quiet signal. "Just give her to us," he said, eyes narrowing. "No one needs to get hurt." My stomach turned at the false concern in his voice. It wasn't a warning, it was permission, permission for himself. The vampire king's gaze flicked to the men behind him, and when he spoke again, it wasn't louder. It was lower, as if he were speaking to the storm. "You are standing in my house," he said. "You will leave with your dignity if you have any left." For a moment, no one moved. Rain hammered the porch roof. Somewhere in the mansion, a clock began to chime, slow and solemn, like a heartbeat in a cathedral. Then the man laughed too quickly, too loudly. "Dignity." He stepped inside without being invited, boots tracking water onto the polished floor. "Listen, old man, this girl doesn't even have a family name worth." "Oh, enough," the vampire king said. It wasn't a shout, it was a boundary. And the man stopped, not because he chose to, because his body refused to go another step, as if the floor had turned to stone beneath his feet. He blinked, confused, then tried again, only his legs trembled and locked. Panic flashed across his face. He looked down at himself, then up at the vampire king. "Oh, what did you do?" The vampire king's voice stayed steady. "I reminded you," he said quietly, "that you are not the strongest thing in every room." The two men behind the doorway stiffened. One reached instinctively into his coat, then hesitated. The mansion felt watchful, the shadows gathered but not aggressive, restrained like hounds held on a leash. I stared at the vampire king, heart thundering. He hadn't attacked, he hadn't harmed. He had stopped the threat the way a lighthouse stops ships from crashing, by being unmovable. The man's breath came faster now. "You can't keep her," he snapped, voice cracking. "She's nothing, she's—" The vampire king finally turned his head and looked at him with something like pity. "Yes," he said, "she is nothing to you." He shifted slightly, just enough that I saw his profile fully in the candlelight, pale, composed, and suddenly unbearably tired. "And that," he continued, "is why you will never understand what I see." My chest tightened. What does he see? The man's eyes darted toward me, then away, as if looking at me too long made him uneasy. "You don't know her," he insisted. The vampire king's gaze softened as it returned to me, and the gentleness in it made my throat burn again. "I know what fear smells like," he said. "I know what it looks like when someone learns to shrink so others can feel large." The words hit too close to home. I felt exposed, not in a cruel way, but in a way that made me want to cry for the person I'd been before tonight, the person who thought being quiet would keep her safe. The man snarled, straining against the invisible force holding him. "Let me go." The vampire king didn't even glance at him. "Apologize," he said simply. The demand was so unexpected it stole the air from the room. An apology from a man like that. The man's face twisted. No. The Vampire King's eyes hardened, not with cruelty but with disappointment. "Then you will leave," he said, "without the satisfaction of believing you were right." He lifted his hand, palm turned slightly outward, and the man slid backward across the floor as if the mansion itself had decided. Not thrown, not battered, guided. The door swung wider and the storm greeted him like a cold verdict. The two men behind him stumbled, catching him before he fell into the rain. The man's rage turned desperate. "This isn't over," he shouted into the hall. "You hear me? She'll regret this." The Vampire King didn't answer. He watched until they were off the porch, until their footsteps vanished into the gardens and the gate clanged shut on its own, final and heavy. Only then did the tension in the room loosen. The candles flickered again, returning to their quiet wavering. The air warmed by a degree. My knees suddenly felt weak, as if my body had been holding itself upright purely on panic. I let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for years. The Vampire King turned to me, and the softness returned to his face, careful, controlled, almost afraid of itself. "You're safe," he said. The words should have comforted me. Instead, they scared me because they made me realize something I hadn't dared to admit. I wanted to believe him. I stared at his hands, steady, elegant, empty of weapons. "You could have done worse," I whispered, to them. A shadow crossed his expression, something like shame. "I have done worse," he said quietly, as if confessing to the room more than to me. "Long ago." My stomach dropped, not because of fear of him, but because of the weight in his voice, like a man who had carried regret for centuries and never once put it down. He stepped away from the door and motioned toward the sitting room. "Come," he said, "before the cold settles into your bones." I followed, still shaking. The sitting room glowed with firelight and smelled faintly of cedar and old books. A blanket lay folded on a chair as if someone had placed it there recently, expecting a guest. That detail struck me harder than any supernatural force. "Expecting me." He poured something dark and steaming into a cup. Tea, I realized when the scent reached me, cloves and orange peel. He held it out, but not too close, letting me choose whether to take it. I did. My fingers brushed the warm porcelain, and I almost cried from the simple proof that warmth still existed in strange places. "Why did you open the gate?" I asked, voice small. The Vampire King looked into the fire for a long moment. When he spoke, it wasn't dramatic. It was honest in a way that felt dangerous. "Well, because I heard you," he said. I frowned. "Heard me." He nodded once, slow. "Not your footsteps," he added, "your heart." The room seemed to tilt. I held the cup tighter. "That's not possible." "It shouldn't be," he agreed, and the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more like a sorrow that remembered how to soften. But tonight it was. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain eased into a steady hush. I felt the mansion's quiet settle around us like a cloak. I should have asked 100 questions. I should have demanded an explanation. Instead, one thought rose above the rest, sharp and trembling. "If he can hear my heart, he can hear what I'm hiding." I lowered my gaze and my voice came out barely audible. "What else do you know about me?" The Vampire King's eyes lifted to mine, and something in them flickered, recognition, shock, and a fear I didn't expect to see in someone so powerful. He set his own untouched cup down as if his hands suddenly weren't steady. "I know," he said, voice strained with a tenderness that didn't belong to monsters, "that you carry a mark you've never seen." My pulse slammed against my ribs. "What mark?" He didn't answer right away. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in velvet. When he opened it, the candlelight caught on a thin ring of silver, set with a dark red stone that looked like it held a sleeping ember. "Oh, this belonged to my queen," he said. I stared, confused. "I'm not royal." His gaze didn't leave my face. "That is what makes it unbearable," he whispered. Then, very gently, as if he feared the truth could shatter me, he added, "Because the ring has been calling for you." The fire popped, loud in the sudden silence, and I realized my hand was trembling so hard the tea rippled in the cup. Outside, far beyond the locked gate, a new sound carried through the wet night. 3 slow knocks, not at the front door, but somewhere deeper in the mansion, as if someone had already found a way inside. The Vampire King's head snapped toward the hallway, all softness gone in an instant. And in that sharp, deadly stillness, he said the words that made my blood run cold. "Do not drink any more of that," he murmured. I didn't make it. The cup froze in my hands. The tea's warmth that had felt like mercy a second ago suddenly felt like a question, one I'd answered without thinking. I set it down slowly, watching the surface ripple, and my stomach tightened with a quiet, humiliating fear. The Vampire King moved first, not fast in a flashy way, but with the efficiency of someone who has learned to survive disasters without making noise. He took the cup and smelled it, his expression sharpening as if he were reading a letter written in poison. Then he looked at me, not accusing, not angry, only intent. "Well, how much?" he asked. "2 sips," I whispered. My voice sounded small in a room that had started to feel too large. He nodded once, as if that number mattered, as if it could be the difference between a bad night and an unthinkable one. He crossed to a small side table where a crystal decanter stood, poured a clear liquid into another cup, and brought it to me. "Drink this," he said, slowly. I hesitated. The cruelest trick fear plays is making you doubt the one person who's protecting you, but his eyes didn't waver. There was no impatience there, just a steady presence that felt like a hand offered across deep water. I drank. The liquid tasted of mint and smoke and something bright like snowmelt. It cooled my throat, and the tightness behind my eyes eased a fraction. The 3 knocks came again, deeper in the house. Not at the front door. Oh, inside. The Vampire King's jaw tightened. He set the velvet ring case on the mantel, then reached toward a small bell on the shelf, antique silver untouched by dust, and pressed it without sound. Nothing rang, and yet somewhere beyond the walls the mansion seemed to shift its attention, like guards waking in their posts. "Stay by the fire," he told me. "I can't just sit here," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my own voice. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the smallest flare of approval, as if courage in any form was something he respected more than obedience. "Then stand behind me," he said, "and whatever you hear, do not answer it." A draft ran through the room, cold enough to make the flames bow. The hallway outside darkened, shadows stretching longer than they should. I listened hard, trying to locate footsteps, but what I heard was worse. A soft, careful sound like fingernails brushing the underside of a table. Patient, searching. The Vampire King stepped into the doorway of the sitting room, placing himself between me and the hall. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence alone felt like a locked door. "Show yourself," he said quietly. A laugh answered him, light, almost amused, and far too close. "You always did like manners," a voice purred. A figure stepped into the spill of firelight, and my breath hitched. She was tall and elegant, dressed as if she'd walked out of another century. Her hair was black as ink, pinned with a comb that glittered. Her smile was delicate, practiced, and cold in the way ice can be beautiful. She looked at the Vampire King like she owned a piece of his history. "Lady Seraphine," he said, voice turning flatter, older. I felt his mood change the way weather changes, subtle at first, then undeniable. The air grew heavier, thick with a past I couldn't see. Seraphine's gaze slid to me. Her eyes were a pale gray, almost silver, and they assessed me in one slow sweep, from my damp hair to my trembling hands. "Oh," she said softly, "so it's true. The Vampire King didn't move. You weren't invited." Seraphine's smile deepened. "And yet," she replied, echoing his earlier words, "here I am." The imitation was not accidental. It was a needle meant to find a tender place. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. Who is she? I asked. The vampire king didn't take his eyes off Seraphine. A problem that refuses to stay buried, he said. Seraphine laughed again, and the sound made my skin prickle. Buried, she said. My king, you of all creatures should know, some things don't die just because you wish they would. She stepped closer, and the firelight caught on a necklace at her throat. A red stone, the twin of the one in the ring case. My heart stuttered. Seraphine noticed my stare. You like it? She asked, touching the pendant with a fingertip. It was made for a queen, a real one. The words were soft, but they hit like a slap. I felt heat rise in my face, then shame, old and familiar. The same feeling I'd lived with among people who measured worth by pedigree, money, last names. I thought the castle would be different. I thought he would be different. Then I remembered he was different. He had said I was safe. He had stood between me and the door. He had offered warmth without taking anything. I lifted my chin. I didn't ask for any of this, I said, surprised by my own steadiness. I just wanted to go home. Seraphine's eyes narrowed with interest, as if I'd turned out more entertaining than expected. And you ran into a legend, she murmured. How fortunate. The vampire king's voice cut through the air, calm and lethal. Why are you here, Seraphine? She sighed as if bored by the question. To stop you from making another mistake, she said. You've been lonely for so long you'll crown anything that looks at you with hope. The vampire king flinched. It was small, it was real, I saw it. And something inside me twisted, not because she'd insulted me, but because she'd struck him where it hurt. Well, he didn't deny it. That was the first twist of the blade. The vampire king wasn't just guarding me from danger. He was guarding a fragile part of himself from being shamed into silence again. Seraphine's gaze flicked to the mantle, to the velvet case. Her smile sharpened. You brought it out, she said, almost tender, after all these years. The vampire king's hand curled slightly, then relaxed. Don't, he warned. Seraphine took another step. The shadows in the hall seemed to welcome her, gathering behind her like a cloak. You think the ring calls for her, she said, eyes gleaming. Do you know what it's really doing? My pulse hammered. I looked from her to him. What does she mean? The vampire king's silence lasted a beat too long. Seraphine's smile turned sympathetic in the cruelest way. Poor girl, she said, voice like velvet over a blade. He didn't tell you, did he? Tell me what? My voice cracked. Seraphine tilted her head. That the last time he placed that ring on someone, she whispered, he couldn't save her. The air left my lungs. I stared at the vampire king, searching his face. I expected anger. I expected denial. Instead, I saw grief, controlled, ancient, and so heavy it made him look suddenly human. Seraphine watched me absorb it and sighed with satisfaction. And now, she continued, the ring is waking again. It's hungry for a promise. The room felt colder. The vampire king finally spoke, and his voice was low, hoarse at the edges. The ring isn't hungry, he said. It's cursed. The word landed like thunder. My hands went numb. Cursed, I repeated. Seraphine spread her hands as if offering comfort. A curse with a very simple rule, she said. If he gives you that ring, he binds his throne to your life. My vision blurred. What does that mean? It means, Seraphine said softly, if you die, his kingdom collapses with you. I took a step back, bumping the chair behind me. My mind raced, trying to make the math of it fit. Why would anyone risk that? Why would a king tie his entire world to a stranger? Unless the stranger isn't the point. I looked at him, my voice shaking. Did you bring me here for that? His eyes snapped to mine, and what I saw there stopped my breathing. Not hunger, not manipulation. Vera, for me. No, he said, and the single word was so raw it felt like a hand pressed to a wound. I opened the gate because you were in danger. I brought you inside because you were shaking. and I offered you tea because I wanted you to feel safe." His gaze flicked briefly to the cup on the table, and shame crossed his face. I failed at that. Seraphine leaned closer, delighted by the crack in the moment. "But now you understand," she said to me. "If you stay, you become a target, not because of your bloodline, because of his weakness." Weakness, the word didn't fit him. And yet the way he stood, steady, protective, trembling only in the places that mattered, told me there was a truth inside it. Well, he cared. And caring, in a world of power, is always a risk. The Vampire King's voice dropped into something almost pleading. "Look at me," he said. "I did." "I will not force you," he said. "You can leave at sunrise. I will send guards. I will erase every trail that leads back to you. You will go on with your life, and this castle will remain a rumor you survived." Seraphine clicked her tongue, disappointed. Always noble when it's too late. The Vampire King's eyes flashed. "It's not too late." He turned to the mantel and picked up the velvet case. The ring caught the firelight, and for a moment the red stone looked almost alive, glowing like a heartbeat. He held it out, not like a prize, not like a trap, but like a burden he was offering to carry alone. "This is the truth," he said to me, voice steady again. "If you accept this ring, you will be protected as my own. No one will touch you in my kingdom without paying a price I can afford." He swallowed, and the quiet in the room seemed to tighten around us. "But the curse binds both ways," he continued. "If anything happens to you, I lose everything." My chest ached. He was giving me the power to destroy him just by existing. Seraphine's smile returned. "So," she murmured, "what are you, a kind girl who walks away, or a queen who stays and risks his world?" I stared at the ring, then at the Vampire King's face. In his eyes, I saw the thing that made me trust him more than anyone who'd ever promised me safety. He looked like he expected me to choose myself. Not him, not his throne. My hands shook as I reached forward. And just as my fingertips hovered over the silver band, a third presence entered the room, not a person, but a feeling that slammed into my chest like a sudden wave. The fire dimmed. The shadows on the ceiling twisted into the shape of wings. The Vampire King stiffened, and for the first time tonight he looked truly alarmed. The Seraphine's smile faltered. "No," she breathed. From the darkness of the hallway, a child's voice called out, sweet, familiar, impossible. "Oh, please," it said, "help me." My blood turned to ice because I knew that voice. It was my own from years ago, the night I first learned how to beg without making a sound. The Vampire King's hand closed around my wrist, firm but gentle, as if to keep me anchored to the present. "That isn't you," he whispered urgently. "Do not follow it." But my feet had already shifted, one step toward the hall, my whole body reacting before my mind could protect me. And the voice called again, closer now, trembling with fear. "Oh, please, don't leave me here." My lungs forgot how to work. That voice didn't just sound like me. It sounded like the version of me I kept hidden, small, desperate, trained to survive by becoming quiet. The hallway beyond the sitting room was darker than it had any right to be, as if the mansion's shadows had gathered to form a doorway into memory. I took another step, almost without permission from my own mind. The Vampire King's grip tightened around my wrist, not painful, just urgent. "Look at me," he said, low and steady. "Breathe with me." I wanted to, I truly did, but the voice from the hall trembled again, and it dragged my attention like a hook. "Oh, please," it cried, "you promised you wouldn't forget me." Something inside me broke open. I hadn't promised out loud, but I had promised in the only way a child can, by surviving and hoping it meant something. The Vampire King moved in front of me, blocking the doorway with his body. The firelight outlined him like a shield. "That presence is not human," he said. "It borrows your sorrow because sorrow makes doors." Seraphine, who had been smiling a moment ago, looked suddenly tight around the mouth. She took a careful step back, as if distance could protect her from whatever was approaching. "This isn't mine," she murmured. "I didn't bring it." The vampire king didn't even glance at her. His attention was fixed on the hallway like a man watching the sea pull back before a storm. "Then why is it here?" I asked, voice shaking. "Why does it know me?" His eyes softened, and the softness hurt more than fear. "Because it can taste what you carry," he said. "Unspoken grief, unhealed shame, the kind that lingers in the bones." The voice in the hall shifted, growing calmer, smarter. It stopped pleading and began to coax. "You don't have to be afraid," it said. "I'm alone." I felt my throat tighten. I hated that it worked. I hated that compassion could be used against you. My whole life, kindness had been a thing people took from me, not something they respected. The vampire king lifted his free hand, palm open toward the darkness. His posture stayed controlled, but I could feel the tension in him, like a violin string pulled too tight. "Oh, you have no claim here," he said. A low sound answered him, not a growl, not anything violent, just the vibration of something ancient waking up. The hallway seemed to deepen, stretching longer than the mansion's architecture allowed. The candles in the corridor dimmed to blue pinpoints as if the light had been drained. Then a figure stepped forward. It wore the shape of a child, small shoulders, bare feet, but the edges were wrong, like a reflection in disturbed water. Its face kept shifting between expressions, trying on fear like clothing. When it looked at me, its eyes were too old. The air turned bitter cold. I tried to step back and found my legs trembling. The vampire king shifted slightly so my shoulder brushed his arm, grounding me with that quiet warmth that didn't belong to myths. "Well, stay behind me," he said. The child thing smiled, and the smile did not reach its eyes. "You hide her," it said to him, voice now layered, as if several voices were speaking through one mouth. "But she's already open." The vampire king's jaw tightened. "Leave," he repeated. The thing ignored him. It looked at me with a tenderness so perfect it felt rehearsed. "Come," it said gently. "I can show you how to stop hurting." My eyes burned. There were nights I would have followed any voice that promised that. The vampire king must have seen the pull in my face because his voice changed, softer, closer, meant only for me. "Pain that is healed does not demand you abandon yourself," he whispered. "Anything that asks you to step into darkness alone is not here to save you." I swallowed hard. Then what is it here to do? His gaze flicked to the ring case on the mantel, then back to the child thing. "To bind you," he said, "to make you choose fear over your own life, to make you choose it over me." Seraphine let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but it cracked on the edge of panic. "It's the wraith of vows," she said, like naming it might make it manageable. "It feeds on promises and regret. If it gets her to follow, it can seal the curse permanently." My chest tightened. The curse, the ring. The vampire king's eyes flickered with frustration, at Seraphine for speaking, at himself for not telling me sooner. "The ring's curse is old," he said quickly. "It was created to punish a king for loving a mortal too fiercely. It ties the throne to the heart that wears it, and the wraith hunts the next heart to make sure the king never loves without suffering." The child thing tilted its head, amused. "He speaks as if he is above it," it murmured. "But he fears it. He fears what he becomes when he loves." I felt the vampire king's arm tense beside me. Not rage, something harder to admit. A fear of himself. The wraith took a step forward. The floorboards didn't creak. The air didn't move. It was like watching an idea approach you. "Come," it said again, now using my voice from tonight, adult and trembling. "He'll leave you eventually. Everyone does." My stomach turned. That sentence was an old bruise. Before I could stop myself, words spilled out, honest, wounded, dangerous. "You don't know that." The wraith's smile widened. "I do," it purred, "because you already believe it." A tear slipped down my cheek. I hated it. I wiped it away, angry at my own softness. The vampire king turned slightly toward me, and in the firelight his face looked almost unbearably human, like someone who had worn power for so long it had become armor, and yet somehow still felt everything. You are allowed to be afraid, he told me, but do not let fear decide your worth. The wraith's eyes gleamed. Pretty words, it said. Will you stake your kingdom on them, king? The vampire king didn't answer with threats. He did something stranger. Well, he bowed his head, just a little, not to the wraith, but toward me, as if acknowledging that the next choice wasn't his to make. I will not command you, he said softly, but I will tell you the truth I wish someone had told me long ago. He lifted his eyes to mine. In them I saw centuries, yes, but also a quiet desperation that made my chest ache. Some doors open because we are wounded, he said. Other doors open because we are brave enough to heal. If you follow that voice, it will wear you like a memory. It will take your hope and call it devotion. The wraith's expression sharpened, irritated, as if the king had named the trick. Seraphine swallowed hard. If it touches her, she warned, it will brand her vow into the curse. She'll be bound to the throne whether she wants it or not. I stared at the wraith, then at the ring on the mantle, glowing like an ember, then at the vampire king, standing between me and the darkness with no certainty I would choose him and still choosing to protect me anyway. My heartbeat roared in my ears. The wraith extended a small hand. You're tired, it whispered. Just one step, I'll carry the hurt for you. My feet shifted forward again, caught between compassion and self-preservation. The vampire king's hand rose and covered mine, warm, steady, real. Stay, he whispered. It was not an order. It was a plea quiet enough that only someone listening with their whole heart could hear it. And I realized the terrifying truth. If I stayed, I wasn't just choosing safety. I was choosing to be seen. I drew a shaking breath and looked the wraith straight in its two old eyes. You can't have me, I said, voice trembling. You don't get to use my pain. The wraith's smile collapsed into something sharp. Then give me a vow, it hissed, and the shadows surged behind it like a tide. In that instant, the vampire king stepped forward, and instead of striking, instead of roaring, he did the one thing I didn't expect from a creature the world called a monster. He opened his hand over his own heart. I give you mine, he said. The seraphine gasped, no. The room seemed to stop. Even the fire held its breath. The wraith leaned in eager. A king's vow, it whispered, savoring the words. Speak it, bind yourself. The vampire king's eyes never left mine. His voice softened, and what he said next felt like a confession offered on bare palms. I vow, he began, that she will never be treated as lesser in my kingdom, not by blood, not by birth, not by anyone's cruelty. My throat tightened. The vow wrapped around me like a cloak, and it was so pure it hurt. The wraith shuddered with delight as if drinking from the air. The shadows thickened. The vampire king continued, and his voice broke just slightly, the smallest fracture in a perfect mask. I vow she will have choice, always. The wraith's eyes flared, annoyed for the first time. It hadn't expected that word. Choice. It took another step forward, and the air turned sharper like winter. Finish it, it demanded. Give me the vow that seals her to you. The vampire king's jaw clenched. I felt his hand tighten around mine. Warmth, restraint, fear. He was fighting himself. I understood then, the wraith didn't just want promises. It wanted the kind of promise that turns love into possession. The vampire king looked at me as if asking permission for something he didn't deserve. And I did the quiet, heroic thing my whole life had tried to teach me not to do. I stepped beside him. Not behind him, beside him. I faced the wraith, shoulders shaking, and lifted my chin. You want a vow? I said, voice trembling but clear. Here's mine. The vampire king turned his head sharply. No, he whispered, alarmed. But I was already speaking because I finally understood that vows can be weapons or they can be healing. I vow, I said, feeling the words burn in my chest, that I will not abandon myself again. The wraith recoiled as if struck. The shadows hissed and pulled back. For a heartbeat, hope surged through me. Then the wraith smiled, slow, cruel, victorious. A vow to yourself, it purred, still counts. The mansion's lights flickered wildly. The air snapped like a rope pulled tight. And the ring on the mantel flared bright red, as if answering my words. The vampire king went utterly still. His eyes widened, not with fear of the wraith, fear of what my vow had just awakened. Because the silver ring lifted from the velvet on its own, floating in the air between us like a living ember. And it began to drift toward my hand,